He sent the invitation on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that said everything about the man he had become. Not a Friday, when the gesture might have felt impulsive, born of wine and old feeling. Not a Monday, when it might have passed for a business decision. A Tuesday, deliberate, calm. The way you sign a document you've already decided to sign, the way you close a door you've been meaning to close for years. His assistant, a young man named Frederick, who wore his ambition visibly, the way some people wear cologne, had hand-delivered it to the lobby of the building she owned. The cardstock was thick, cream-colored, embossed with silver lettering. Mr. Julian Harwick requests the pleasure of your company at the celebration of his marriage to Miss Camille Beaumont LaRose. Saturday, the 14th of June. The Ritz-Carlton, Montreal. At the bottom, in Julian's own handwriting, and she recognized it, had once loved it, had once read notes left on her kitchen counter in that same slanted script. He had added 4 words. Hope you can make it. The woman who received that card stood at her office window on the 22nd floor and read it twice. Then she set it face down on her desk and went back to the earnings call she had been preparing for. Her assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Bet, who had worked with her for 6 years, watched this happen and said nothing. She had learned, over those 6 years, that the most important things were the ones that got the least visible reaction. Her name was Yvonne Fontaine. She was 43 years old. She had grown up in the East End of Hamilton, Ontario, in a house with radiator heat and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left. Her mother had cleaned offices. Her father had driven freight. They had not had money, but they had had standards, which her mother insisted was the better of the two. Yvonne had believed her, had carried that belief through a full scholarship to Waterloo, through a master's at McGill, through 12 years of building a data security firm from a sublet desk in a shared workspace on Saint Laurent, into a company with offices in 4 cities and a client list that included 2 provincial governments and a national bank. She had built it while married to Julian Harwick. That was the part the invitation was designed to make her forget. They had met at a conference in Ottawa, when Yvonne was 31 and Julian was 34. He was working in financial consulting then, mid-level, pleasant-looking in the way of men who have always been told they are more intelligent than they are. He had approached her at the hotel bar after her panel and asked what she thought was the single biggest failure of Canadian tech policy. She had told him, at length. He had listened with what seemed like genuine attention. Later, she would understand that listening was the skill he had cultivated most carefully, the one that made people feel chosen, seen, worth the effort. They married in 2013 at a small ceremony in the Gatineau Hills. 14 guests, a judge. Her mother in a blue dress that had taken 4 months to pay for. Julian's parents, both professors, who smiled at Yvonne with the specific warmth of people who have decided to be open-minded. The early years were good. She was honest about that, even later when honesty cost her something. But the company began to grow in 2016, and growth changed the geometry of the marriage in ways neither of them acknowledged out loud. Her hours lengthened, her attention divided. Julian, who had by then moved into a senior role at a Bay Street consulting firm, began to speak about her work the way you speak about a hobby that has gotten slightly out of hand. He was supportive, technically, present at dinners where her investors gathered, cordial when her colleagues called, but support, she would eventually understand, has a texture, and his had changed, from something warm and freely given to something careful and conditional, offered in exchange for a version of her that no longer existed. When they divorced in 2020, he told her it was because she had chosen the company over the marriage. She had not argued. She had been too tired to argue, and too honest to pretend he was entirely wrong. She signed the papers, sold the house on Elm Ridge Drive that they had picked together, and moved into a condo downtown that she paid for entirely herself. She did not ask for anything from him. Not because she wasn't entitled, her lawyers had made very clear what she was entitled to, but because she understood at a level below language that taking anything from Julian would mean owing him a version of her story. She didn't want his version. She wanted her own. For 2 years after the divorce, she rebuilt. Not the company. The company was fine, better than fine, had cleared 40 million in revenue the year the marriage ended. But herself. She ran. She cooked badly, and then learned to cook well. She called her mother every Sunday. She took a week alone in Cape Breton and walked along the Cabot Trail in the rain, because she had always wanted to, and had never found the time, and she stood on a cliff above the Atlantic and understood that the grief she was feeling was not for Julian specifically, but for the version of herself that had believed a marriage could be a kind of shelter. She came back from Cape Breton with mud on her boots and a clearer idea of what she wanted to build next. What she built was a firm called Achibi Strategic Solutions, a consultancy that helped mid-size Canadian companies identify and close vulnerabilities in their data infrastructure. She had spotted the gap 2 years earlier, had filed 3 patents on proprietary assessment methodology before the divorce was final, and had waited quietly until she had the capital and the team to move. By the end of her first year, she had 16 clients. By the end of the second, she had been profiled in the Globe and Mail, The Logic, and a technology quarterly out of Vancouver, whose editor had called her, without apparent irony, the most dangerous woman in Canadian tech. She kept that headline in a folder on her desktop, not because she was proud of the framing. Dangerous was an odd word to use for a woman who paid her taxes and remembered everyone's birthdays, but because it reminded her that other people's limited imagination was not her responsibility. She was in the middle of a Series B, close, when Frederick delivered the envelope. She read it. She set it face down. She went back to the earnings call. 3 days later, Bet appeared in her doorway with the expression she wore when she had information she wasn't sure how to deliver. Yvonne was eating a sandwich at her desk and reviewing a contract amendment. "You're going to the wedding," Bet said. It was not a question. Yvonne took another bite of the sandwich. "I haven't decided. You have that look." "What look?" "The one you had before you filed the counterproposal on the Leduc contract. Very still, like you're watching something from across a room." Yvonne set the sandwich down. Outside, it was one of those March afternoons in Montreal that couldn't decide between winter and something else. The sky a flat, considered gray, the streets wet with melt. She thought about Julian choosing Tuesday to send the card. She thought about his handwriting. She thought about the fact that he had sent it to her office and not her home, which meant he had used the building address, the public one, the one on the company website, which meant he wanted her to receive it not as a person, but as a credential, a witness, an audience. "I'll need to move the Halifax call," she said. Bet did not smile. She was not a smiling at moments of triumph kind of person, which was one of the reasons Yvonne valued her. "I'll move it," she said. There was a question Yvonne's mother asked her during their Sunday call when Yvonne mentioned the invitation. "Why would you go?" "Because he wants me to feel small," Yvonne said, "and I want to remember that I don't." Her mother was quiet for a moment. She had been cleaning offices for 31 years. She understood, in a way that didn't require articulation, what it meant to walk into a room where you were not expected to matter and to matter anyway. "Wear something they won't forget," she said. Yvonne wore black, a structured column dress, single shoulder, with a line so clean it looked architectural. She wore the watch her company had given her when they hit 50 million in revenue. Not large, not flashy, the kind of thing that only registered to people who knew what they were looking at. She arrived in a car she had hired through her usual service, and she arrived with 4 colleagues from her leadership team. Not bodyguards, exactly, though 2 of them happened to be former RCMP, and 1 had a background in corporate security, and all of them were in the ordinary way of people who had built careers protecting things of value, very calm in rooms that were supposed to be unsettling. She was not there to make a scene. She was simply there. The Ritz-Carlton atrium had been dressed for the occasion with a specificity that suggested Julian had either hired an excellent planner or had been deeply involved himself. Probably both. White lilies and eucalyptus everywhere. Candles in low glass vessels on every surface. A string quartet playing something that Yvonne recognized as Debussy played too precisely, without feel. The guests were the kind of people Julian had always wanted to impress. Bay Street names: a former cabinet minister, a couple of people from the television industry in Toronto, the kind of old money Westmount presence that arrived with good posture and quiet shoes. They registered when Yvonne walked in. Not all of them, but enough. She saw Julian across the room before he saw her. He was standing near the bar with his groomsmen, three men who had known him since his MBA, who had the collective ease of people who had never had to work hard to be in the rooms they were in. Julian himself was in a midnight blue suit, a white pocket square folded with precision. He was laughing at something. He looked in the specific way of men who have arranged their lives carefully, very pleased with himself. Then someone touched his arm and tilted their head, very slightly, in her direction. The laugh stopped. Yvonne watched him see her. She watched him take in the dress, the watch, the four people with her. She watched him calculate something. She could see it happen, the quick reassessment behind his eyes, and arrive at an answer that was not the one he had expected. She did not wave. She did not nod. She picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and turned to speak to the woman beside her, a Montreal architect named Dalis Okonkwo, who had been a client for 3 years and who was, in the ordinary way of architects, paying attention to the ceiling. "Beautiful plasterwork," Dalis said. "It is." Yvonne agreed. The ceremony happened. Julian married Camille Beaumont Larose, who was 31 and worked in wealth management, and had a particular way of holding her shoulders that suggested she had been told, many times, that she was marrying well. Yvonne watched from a seat near the back. She felt less than she had expected to feel, which she understood was its own kind of information. What she felt, mainly, was a clear and somewhat impersonal recognition that this room, this moment, this carefully arranged afternoon, none of it had anything to do with her. She had been invited to witness something, and what she was witnessing was Julian's need to be witnessed. She was an audience, and audiences, she had learned, had the right to leave. She stayed through dinner because she had decided to stay through dinner, and because the seating had placed her at a table with a venture capital partner from Toronto and a technology lawyer from Ottawa who both wanted to talk about the data governance legislation moving through Parliament, and the conversation was genuinely interesting, and she found, as she had often found in her life, that genuinely interesting conversations had a way of clarifying what actually mattered. The speeches happened. Julian's best man made a joke that didn't quite land. Camille's sister cried in the way of younger sisters who are happy and also, in some corner of themselves, uncertain. Julian himself stood and raised a glass and thanked everyone for coming and said, with a fullness that sounded practiced, that this was the beginning of everything he had ever wanted. Yvonne drank her wine and did not think about the 12 years that had preceded that sentence. It was during the dessert course that things shifted. She had not orchestrated what happened next. She wanted to be clear about that. Later, when people asked, and people did ask, because Montreal is a smaller city than it appears, and rooms like that one have long memories. She had not arranged anything. She had simply been, for the past 2 years, living her life in a way that made certain things inevitable. The technology lawyer at her table, a precise, attentive man named Armand, who had worked with her firm on 3 separate occasions, leaned across the white tablecloth and said, quietly, "I had a meeting this morning with the OSC. Did you know Julian's firm is under preliminary review?" She hadn't. She had known, in a general way, that Julian's consulting practice had moved into some ambiguous territory around financial advisory services without the corresponding licensing. She had noticed it 2 years ago, had even mentioned it to him once, briefly, in a conversation he had not taken seriously. But she had not known about the OSC. "When did it start?" she asked. 3 weeks ago, Armand said. "It's not public yet, but it will be." Yvonne set down her dessert fork. Across the room, Julian was dancing with Camille. The string quartet had been replaced by a DJ, who was playing something that had been popular 18 months ago. The lilies were still white. The candles were lower now. The cabinet minister was leaving, she noticed. Early, quietly. The way people leave rooms when they have been told something that changes the geometry of the evening. She stayed until 10 o'clock. Then she collected her coat, black cashmere, not borrowed, and said goodbye to Dalis and Armand and the venture capital partner. And she walked through the atrium with her team around her, unhurried, without looking back. In the lobby, one of Julian's groomsmen, the one who had been laughing the loudest before the ceremony, who had been most publicly amused by the fact of her presence, passed her near the exit. He did not make eye contact. He had spent the latter part of the evening on his phone, with the particular focused stillness of someone managing a situation. The car was waiting. She did not think about the evening in an organized way on the drive home. She thought about her mother's blue dress. She thought about the Cape Breton cliff and the rain. She thought about the folder on her desktop with the word dangerous in the headline. She thought about the patents she had filed before the divorce was final. About the 16 clients that had become 43. About the earnings call she had pushed back by a week to attend a wedding she had never needed to attend. And then she stopped thinking about it, because she had a board meeting on Monday and a term sheet to review, and a call with a deputy minister on Thursday that she had been preparing for longer than she cared to admit. The driver was a quiet man who had been with the service for years. He did not ask how her evening had been. She appreciated this. At home she made tea. She stood at her window. Not the office window now, but the one in her condo, which looked out over the St. Lawrence and the lights of the South Shore, which was a view she had chosen deliberately. The way she chose most things now, and she drank the tea and watched the river move. The invitation was still in her desk drawer, face down, where she had left it. She did not think of it as a weapon he had pointed at her. She thought of it as a question. The kind of question someone asks when they have forgotten what they're actually asking. Julian had wanted to know if she was diminished. He had wanted to see proof. And she had gone, not to give him proof of anything, but because she had understood, in that clear-eyed way that had cost her so much and given her more, that a question answered in the right room, by the right presence, in the right silence, is its own kind of closing statement. She rinsed her mug. She left it on the counter. She went to bed. The OSC review became public 6 weeks later. It was reported in the Globe first, then picked up by BNN Bloomberg, then, with considerably more detail and heat, by a financial newsletter that had been covering the gray zones of Canadian advisory practices for 3 years. Julian's firm was not the only firm implicated, but it was the one with the most recognizable name, and names, in this industry, were the thing you could not easily recover. Yvonne read the initial Globe piece on a Wednesday morning while walking on her treadmill. She read it carefully, the way she read everything. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, if anything, a kind of dry clarity, the same feeling she'd had when a market prediction she'd made 2 years ahead of consensus finally arrived. Not satisfaction, exactly. More like the feeling of a proof completing itself. She forwarded the article to her general counsel with a note. No comment to any media. Refer any calls to comms. She got off the treadmill. She showered. She had a breakfast meeting at 8 with a potential partner in the AI governance space. And the woman was sharp and well prepared, and Yvonne did not want to be anything less than fully present for it. Julian called once. It was 3 days after the Globe piece. A Sunday afternoon. Yvonne was on her couch with a novel she had been meaning to read for 2 years, which she had promised herself she would finish by the end of the month. Her phone showed his name in a way that seemed almost confused, as if the phone itself wasn't sure this contact still applied. She let it go to voicemail. She did not listen to the voicemail that day. She finished her chapter, made dinner, salmon, roasted sweet potatoes, something her mother had taught her when she was 16, and called her mother at 7, as she always did on Sundays. "How are things?" her mother asked. "Good," she said, and meant it, which was not always the same thing. She listened to the voicemail 2 days later, in her car, on the way to a client meeting in Laval. Julian's voice was carefully composed. She could hear the care in it, the same care she'd heard when he was managing something, presenting a version of a situation rather than the situation itself. He said he'd seen she was doing well. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings, he said, and here the composure slipped by a fraction of a degree, that he had always respected what she had built. She noted, without surprise, that he said what she had built, not what they had built, not what we worked toward, just hers, clean, separate, as if that had always been the acknowledged truth. She supposed it had. She deleted the message. She went to her meeting in Laval, where a manufacturing company with aging infrastructure needed to understand why their data was more vulnerable than they believed. She was good at explaining this. She had always been good at finding the gap between what people thought was secure and what actually was. 2 months after the wedding, Yvonne was asked to speak at a conference in Toronto, an annual gathering of Black Canadian executives that had been running for 11 years, that had started in a church hall in Scarborough and now filled a hotel conference center downtown. She spoke for 40 minutes about what she had learned building a company in a sector that had not been designed for her entry, about the difference between a room that welcomes you and a room that has simply not gotten around to closing the door, about the specific exhaustion of being excellent in spaces that would prefer to think of excellence as an anomaly. She spoke about the decision she had made, early, to build on her own terms, which meant building slowly and correctly rather than quickly and contingently. She did not mention Julian by name. She did not talk about the marriage. She talked about the moment, in 2018, when a potential investor had suggested that she would be more fundable, with a male co-founder on her letterhead, and how she had thanked him politely, and left the meeting and walked 4 blocks in the rain, sir, and stood outside a coffee shop on King Street and understood, with great precision, that she had a choice to make, and that the choice was not about the investor. The audience was quiet, in the way that rooms get quiet when something true is being said. She did not end with a lesson. She had learned to distrust endings that arrived too cleanly, that wrapped the hard parts in language that made them sound resolved. What she said, instead, was that the most important thing she had ever done was to decide that her own account of her life was the one that would hold. Not anyone else's, not the investors, not a headline's, not an ex-husband's. There was applause. She shook hands. She took a photograph with a group of young women from a Scarborough tech program who had come to hear her specifically, who had printed her name on a banner that said, "We see you in silver, let us." And she looked at that banner for a moment longer than she meant to, because she had not, for a long time, thought of herself as someone who needed to be seen. She had thought of herself as someone who needed to be accurate. She was beginning to understand that these were not the same thing. On the Sunday after the conference, she called her mother. "How was Toronto?" her mother asked. "Good," she said. "Full. You sound tired." "I am the good kind." She heard her mother in the kitchen, a cup being set down, the particular creak of the chair at the kitchen table, the one that had been creaking for 20 years and had never been repaired because some things in a house become part of its voice. "He called?" her mother asked. Yvonne had mentioned the voicemail. She did not remember which Sunday. "He did. What did he want?" "Absolution, I think." Her mother said, which was not agreement or disagreement, but a kind of careful listening. "I deleted it," Yvonne said. "All right," her mother said, not approvingly, not disapprovingly. The way she said most important things, as if the fact of them was enough, and she trusted Yvonne to know what to do with facts. They talked for an hour about other things. Her mother's neighbors, who had a new dog. The tomatoes she was planting for the back garden. The sister of a woman at church who had just been accepted to Dalhousie, and was the first in her family. Good news, regular and specific, the kind that accumulated into something that held. Yvonne made tea while they talked and stood at the window over the river, the same window, the same river, the city, on both sides carrying on in the ordinary way of cities that have been doing this for a very long time. She thought about the invitation, face down in her desk drawer. She could throw it away, she supposed. There was no reason to keep it. It had served whatever purpose she had allowed it to serve, which was, she was honest about this, a small one, a confirmation of something she had already known. He had wanted to diminish her, and instead had simply asked her into a room where she happened to be the most solid thing present. She wasn't sure that was his lesson to learn. She wasn't sure he would learn it. She was sure, in the way that she was increasingly sure of things that had taken years to arrive at, that it was not her responsibility to teach him. The river below moved the way it always moved, patient, directional, without particular interest in being watched. She watched it anyway. Outside, a bird crossed low over the water and disappeared toward the south shore, unhurried. She finished her tea. She said goodnight to her mother. She went to her desk, picked up the card, cream, embossed, 4 words in familiar handwriting, and placed it in the recycling without reading it again. Then she opened her laptop and got back to work.